Prosperity Foregone 2. The income and employment lost due to Canadian climate policies. Hi, I'm Michelle Stirling for Friends of Science Society, and lately there's been quite a bit of discussion about the fact that Canada has lost a lot of potential income by not being able to get liquefied natural gas, LNG, to market, particularly to Europe, and particularly to help our trade partner and friend, Germany. Now, some years ago, Robert Lyman did a presentation called Prosperity Foregone, and in it, he tried to explain to the public the number of very big infrastructure and energy projects that had been cancelled, delayed, or where the investors had just run away from Canada because our climate and environment regulations are becoming so ridiculously stringent. The opportunities for every Tom, Dick, and Harry to intervene at any point along the process has just made investors throw up their hands and walk away. So, in the National Post, Canada just missed possibly one of the greatest opportunities in its history. And Laurie Goldstein, who actually I really like his work, but it's funny that he said here Canada neglected to build natural gas pipelines and LNG plants to Tidewater. I'll show you that we didn't neglect it at all. We just couldn't get it done. And Tristan Hopper wrote a funny tweet. Government somehow thinks that somehow lost money selling weed, wonders if there's a business case for selling natural gas to a continent about to freeze to death. And the National Post, at current prices, even just one Canadian port exporting liquid natural gas could be adding 9 figures, that means we're in the billions of dollars, to the Canadian GDP every day. Politically, Canada could be helping to deal a body blow to Russian hegemony over Western European energy. So here's something from 2nd Street and Canada Action. They've put together this cancelled, delayed resource project in Canada over the past 5 years. Now, if you don't follow the energy sector, you probably have never heard of any of these. If you live in Quebec or Ontario, there might only be 1 or 2 here that you've heard of. And, if you live in a city, like, really, who cares? I mean, these are all like grubby trade jobs, right? That are only worth billions of dollars. So we got Pacific Northwest LNG, LNG Aurora, WCC Aurora, Steelhead LNG, Mackenzie Valley, Energy East, that would be oil from the oil sands, Jocelyn Oil Sands, Grassy Point LNG, Trans Mountain, which is still under development, Northern Gateway, that would be oil. Black Thor, I'm not sure what that is. Carmen Creek Oil Sands, Aspen Oil Sands, Dunkirk, SAGD, that's a type of steam-assisted gravity work which does not require surface mining in the oil sands. The new Prosperity Mine in BC, Ajax Copper Mine in BC, Star Diamond Mine in Saskatchewan, Muskwa SAGD, that's again another special oil sands development, Coffee Gold in the Yukon Territories, Eagle's Nest in Ontario, I don't know that project, Matouche Uranium in Quebec, and Alton Natural Gas. So look at the billions of dollars. Look at it, it's $195.9 billion that's gone south, if you like, or somewhere, because either our regulatory situation is too cumbersome, or the environmental groups and all the other activists just made it terribly burdensome. And at this point, again, people may not know, but climate activists are actively harassing banks and insurance companies to not insure or finance any energy projects in Canada. So, with some of these big projects, you can't go forward if you don't have proper financing and insurance in place. And really, these climate activists don't contribute anything to the economy. They are taking from the economy, they're blocking jobs, they're blocking prosperity. And that's what this presentation is going to show you. And here's a prime example. Excuse me. This is from our report, Manufacturing a Climate Crisis. West Coast environmental law was very instrumental in instituting the North Coast oil tanker ban. They were funded by the Oak Foundation, which is one of the Climate Works partners. And the funding was kind of small, but it was foreign funding. And the point was to constrain development in the Alberta tar sands through a legislative ban on crude oil tankers on British Columbia's north coast. This would necessitate the cancellation of Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline to transport tar sands, oil, and bitumen to Asian markets. So this is back in 2010. So doesn't that sound like international market interference to you? And then it goes on to say, West Coast environmental law aims to establish the conditions under which A, opposition parties holding a parliamentary majority work together to enact a legislative tanker ban under a minority government and or incorporate a ban promise in their manifestos, committing them to act following an election that produces a majority government, and B, First Nations declare their own bans on transportation of tar sands crude oil through their territories and waters. And of course, this was Justin Trudeau's election promise. If I'm elected Prime Minister, the Northern Gateway pipeline won't become reality. And that's exactly what happened. But you can see there was foreign interference here, there was foreign money here, and this is, WCEL is a tax-subsidized Canadian environmental charity. So before we get to the details, excuse me, of the projects that have been cancelled, I want to jump ahead to an article that Robert Lyman wrote in 2021 in October. And Robert Lyman is a 27-year veteran of the public service in Canada. He was a diplomat for 10 years. He's worked on the energy, transportation, and GHG sector for most of his career. And he's asking, will we squander Canada's energy resource heritage? So in the article, excuse me, in the article he talks about oil, gas, and coal and their relative importance to our economy. So you can go back and read the detail there. But I want to just give you this summary right now so that you get the gist of what we're talking about, especially in light of what the National Post quotes said that I just read. So to sum up the previous sections, which he wrote on oil, gas, and coal, if they could be sold at present international prices, Canada's fossil fuel reserves would yield gross revenues of about US $21 trillion. While it is far more difficult to assess the likely net revenues that could result, it would be easily in the range of $13 trillion Canadian. And the infrastructure to move it to market, including pipelines, railways, and ports, probably adds at least 300 billion. So how much is 13 trillion Canadian? I won't read all of these details. I'll start here and then I'll read the highlights. If you could somehow spend $1 million a day, it would take over 35,600 years to spend 13 trillion. With 13 trillion, you could pay off Canada's entire national debt 13 times. With 13 trillion, you could give every Canadian $342,000. Now that sounds like winning the lottery. So now let's go back into the original presentation of Robert Lyman's. And he did this for these purposes, to document the estimated losses to Canada due to governmental climate and related environmental policies in terms of foregone investment, foregone employment, and additional costs to consumers. And the outline is the purpose, climate policy framework, pipeline and resource projects cancelled, moratoria imposed, effects of pipeline constraints, regulatory changes and caps, carbon dioxide taxes and emissions trading systems, mandated conversion from coal to wind and solar generation, and a conclusion. So the Canadian Climate Policy Framework, he's saying that the Trudeau government has embraced greenhouse gas emissions as the overriding goal of public policy, and under the Pan-Canadian Framework, the governments have implemented over 230 emissions reductions measures, and there are differences over role and authority to impose carbon taxes. The voluntary target of 30% emission reduction by 2030 is being treated politically as mandatory, and the Trudeau government has announced the goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. So here's the first project, which I just mentioned, Northern Gateway Pipeline. You can see where it was supposed to go. It was supposed to cost $7.9 billion, that it would have a projected impact on our gross domestic product of $30 billion over 30 years. It would add $2.6 billion to government revenues, create 1,560 long-term jobs, 3,000 construction jobs. Now, this project was under review for 4.5 years. And the reason for the cancellation, it was initially approved in 2014 by the Harper government and cancelled in 2015 by the Trudeau government imposed ban on northern BC coastal tanker traffic, which I mentioned before in regard to West Coast environmental law and the foreign funding they received. Energy East. So the estimated capital cost was $12 billion. Impact on GDP, $35.5 billion. Projected impact on government revenues, $10 billion. Projected employment benefits, 10,000 full-time jobs during development and construction, and 1,000 during operations. Period of review, 4 years. Reason for cancellation, Trudeau government, almost 4 years into the review, directed the National Energy Board to broaden the scope of review to include upstream and downstream GHG emissions. So just a note to people who aren't familiar with the flows of money in terms of government, when you have big projects like this, you have them paying taxes to the government in the form of revenues and royalties, and this is what funds daily life in Canada. This is the money that funds education and hospitals, healthcare, infrastructure like roads that you drive on, and of course all the people that are employed. When they have good paying jobs, they also pay taxes, and that also goes to the tax pool, which in turn supports all the needs of everyday Canadians at every level. So climate activists have so far not shown us how they will replace the lost revenues from such developments with their green subsidized projects that actually take money from the tax pool and don't return it. So, we're looking at serious deficit situations here if we're planning on going all green. Let's go back to this. So those are two big projects. Trans Mountain, of course, this is still under construction. At the time, the estimated cost was $12.6 billion. The government has now bought it. The projected impact on GDP, $18.5 billion. Projected impact on government revenues, $46.7 billion over 20 years. Employment, 5,500 jobs during construction alone. And it was under review for 6.5 years. And the reason for delay were delays in approval by the Trudeau government, legal opposition by Eco-Justice in British Columbia and others, Aboriginal and environmental groups, and the relevant court decisions. So the totals for just those three pipelines, $32.5 billion in capital investment, foregone. That means gone, it's out. $65.3 billion in national income, foregone. 35,000 long-term jobs, foregone. and $1.5 billion lost on expenses to prepare and present applications for court, and also, I guess, for applications for this work, and additional billions of dollars in inflated costs due to regulatory delays. Now we have some LNG projects. Aurora LNG, the sponsor was Nexen Energy. Capital cost, $28 billion. We don't have the projected impact on GDP here. Employment, 4,000 to 5,000 person years during construction, 200 to 400 permanent jobs over 25 years. Under review for 5 years. Reason for cancellation, change in market conditions during the review process. Example, projects in other countries moved ahead faster. Prince Rupert LNG, project lead, Royal Dutch Shell. Projected capital cost, $16 billion. Projected impact on GP not available or employment benefits. It was under review for 4.5 years. Shell decided to cancel so it could focus on other BC LNG project in Kitimat, related to Coastal GasLink, which is now being held up by opposition from 5 unelected natives and really violent attacks by environmental groups. WCC LNG, sponsor Exxon, projected cost capital cost $25 billion. Projected employment 1,000 to 6,000 person years during construction, 250 to 300 permanent jobs during operation. Period of review 4 years. And why did it cancel? Exxon stated it wanted to pursue other LNG investment opportunities elsewhere. Teck, Frontier Oil Sands Mine. So this is going to the oil sands now, not LNG. Projected capital cost, $20.6 billion. Impact on GDP not available. Projected impact on government revenues, $70 billion. Employment benefits, 7,000 jobs during construction, 2,500 jobs for 41 years. Period under review, 8 years. Reason for cancellation, uncertainty engendered by federal energy policies. And may I also say here that about the time that Teck approval was really hanging in the balance and people didn't know if the government would approve it, if Teck would go forward or pull out, a group of climate activist kids that were about 10 years old, children of climate activists, said they were going to go on a hunger strike if this was approved. So you can imagine you're a major corporation and you're going to have starving 10-year-old children of climate activists in the headline news every day. And in fact, CBC did a full-out spread on how does a hunger strike affect the body on CBC Kids. So, rather than a media trying to calm the situation down, we have the tax-funded CBC, seemingly, to my opinion anyway, inciting more crazy action by children who should be protected and not encouraged or incited to engage in dangerous acts like a climate strike over a perfectly legal and necessary infrastructure development in Canada that's worth billions of dollars, that would save hundreds of children's lives because it would finance healthcare, education, local charities, food banks. I'm not sure that people are really aware of the implications of these activists. Then there's also a moratorium on northern drilling. In 2016, with no supporting analysis, the Trudeau government imposed a permanent moratorium on new offshore oil and gas exploration in northern Canada. In 2018, with no analysis, it expanded that to include all offshore oil and gas activities. And in response to territorial government's pressure in October, they began consulting on a future shared management of the Beaufort Sea And there are 63 existing exploration and discovery licenses and billions of dollars in undeveloped resource potential. Pipeline constraints. In September 2018, Western Canadian oil production reached 4.3 million barrels a day, but the takeaway capacity on existing pipelines was only 3.9 million. So, once you're getting oil out of the ground or out of the refinery, you got to get it to market. It's got to have a place to go. So this resulted in depressed prices for Canadian heavy crude relative to U.S. crude and other international benchmarks. By November, Canadian heavy crude was selling in U.S. markets at a 70% discount. Over the 2014 to 2018 period, Canadian producers' revenues declined by $40.6 billion due to discounted heavy crude prices. And the best long-term solution is the addition of pipeline capacity that will allow access to Pacific markets. Regulatory changes. The average approval time for new pipeline projects in Canada increased from 357 days in 2009 to 831 days in 2013 and was still 681 days by 2016. Several changes have been made that worsen the outlook for project approvals. Expanded and more complex environmental assessment, regulatory layering, politicization of approval process, imposition of climate-related tests and caps, and significantly increased consultation requirements. Regulatory caps. Alberta has imposed a statutory cap on emissions from oil sands of 100 million tons per year. Assuming continuation of current emissions intensity improvements, the policy could result in cumulative production losses between 2027 and 2040 of over 2 billion barrels of oil, with a lost value of 153 billion Canadian dollars. Now, that was in 2015 dollars, so that number would have changed. During recent review of the Teck Frontier project, the panel interpreted the federal government's emissions target to be 150 million tons for the whole economy in 2050, compared to 716 million tons in 2017. Taxes. Canadian carbon dioxide taxation regime is a highly balkanized system that includes a mix of direct taxes, output-based pricing for industry, and emissions trading. Tax rate is now generally Canadian $30 a ton and will rise to $50 a ton in 2022, with future rates uncertain. Well, we know that they now want to raise it to $170 a ton. Taxation regime does not substitute for direct action measures, but adds another layer. And partial rebate system. That means your Canada, your Climate Action Initiative rebate has subdued public opposition. But the primary economic effect is to raise consumer energy costs and impair competitiveness of emissions-intensive firms in all regions. And yes, costs are going up. It's funny, the media never want to mention carbon taxes. I call that carbon taxophobia. When you hear that they're raising taxes on industry, a lot of social justice activists are like cheering, like, yeah, stick it to big oil, stick it to those big companies, yeah. But what those companies basically do is just, in the course of making whatever product or service they offer, they just add those taxes in, they recoup them from you. So all this cheering is really improperly placed, and it just makes life more difficult for you, as all Canadians know today, and certainly as all the people in Europe know today. Wow, they're really suffering. So the consequences are that Canada lost $100 billion in energy projects in 2 years Investment in oil and gas upstream fell from $125 billion in 2014 to $75 billion in 2018, during a period in which investment grew globally. So in other places around the world, investors were still pumping money into oil and gas, but not Canada. New planned investments in the energy sector fell from $146 billion in 2015 to $35 billion in 2018. This represents 4.5% of Canada's GDP. And new planned investments in pipelines declined from $95 billion in 2016 to $68 billion in 2018. The unemployment rate in Alberta surged to 9% and was 7.2% at the end of 2019, compared to 5.9% nationally. Now, Robert also did a segment here on coal phase-out and the cost of that to Albertans and Ontarians. Excuse me. So Ontario's Green Energy Act in 2009 required utilities to contract for wind and solar generation at above market rates under fixed 25-year contracts, and to give these sources first to the grid rights. That means that when wind or solar are being generated, they are the first power generation sources that go online to give you power. From 2004 to 2014, ratepayer bills for generation costs increased by 80%. The overall cost of electricity increased by 56%. Electricity consumers have had to pay $9.2 billion more than they should have, and 75,000 jobs have been lost as a result. Because of the mismatch between renewable supply and electricity demand, electricity had to be dumped on export markets at a net cost of $3.1 billion from 2009 to 2014, and that continues to today. Phase out of coal-fired generation in Alberta in favor of wind and solar. In 2015, the Alberta government, under the NDP, decided to accelerate the phase out of coal-fired power, so all 18 plants would be closed by 2030, and to introduce carbon taxes. Subsequently, the largest utility investors left the province. The cost of closing 6 plants that could have operated till 2061 has not been published. Well, that's not quite true. We do know, just a second here. We do know from reports in the Herald and Journal in Alberta that compensation of about $11 billion was paid out to TransAlta, so that's like $37 million a year for 13 years that Albertans are paying to TransAlta for coal phase-out, and similar compensation deals were struck with other former coal-producing power generators. So, you know, on the surface, that's at least $22 billion. Now, you have to realize we are now importing coal-fired power from Saskatchewan and Montana. We're importing hydro from British Columbia. We have to pay for that imported power. And the value of using coal before in Alberta is that we have massive coal reserves here. And coal-fired generation was about 2 cents per kilowatt hour at the gate. Now, that's the cheapest you can get. But, you know, you have to realize that coal-fired power plants can't wrap up and down like natural gas plants can. So they don't work well with wind and solar. But what one of our retired engineers told me is that for years, Alberta had been exporting coal-fired power, especially at night, to British Columbia, which allowed them to replenish their hydro reservoirs overnight. And we didn't have to worry about ramping down our coal-fired power plants. So there was a benefit, a mutual benefit to both provinces. And if we have some El Nino years and it's quite dry in BC, that might be a problem for them to not have access to that extra power from us. But the point is that we paid billions of dollars in coal phase-out compensation. There was a big debacle with the province suing itself, the province suing the balancing pool, and the balancing pool propping up the costs of turning the coal permits back in. So there's billions and billions of dollars. I don't know if it can ever be accounted for, and wasted. It's not like it built infrastructure somewhere or invested in some innovative technology. It's just money thrown away. And it's costing us every day now because, of course, now that natural gas prices have spiked worldwide, natural gas is a market commodity. Coal, not so much. So in the past, when markets spiked in natural gas, Alberta had a fallback position. We could go back to using more coal for our base load power and less natural gas, which would help balance costs. We don't have that option anymore. So thanks to very dumb planning, we are facing rising costs. In fact, the average electricity pool price in Alberta has tripled since 2015. So Robert goes on to write, the estimated costs of the wind and solar plants ranges from $4 billion to $8 billion. And wind plants, to be viable, require revenues above $60 to $80 per megawatt hour, and solar requires revenues above $100 per megawatt hour, compared to the previous average pool price of power of $64 per megawatt hour. Renewable energy subsidies. There are dozens of federal and provincial subsidy and tax exemption benefits now accorded to wind and solar energy projects by the federal and provincial governments. No one knows the total cost. Can you believe that? In Europe, the effective wind plus solar cost is 9 times higher than electricity would cost without them. The federal budget 2017 committed $1.55 billion in subsidies to wind and solar over 5 years, and the Alberta 2016 budget committed $3.4 billion of wind and solar projects over 5 years. The uncounted others. The federal government has 66 major programs to reduce GHG emissions. Provinces and territories have 171 more. No one knows the total cost or degree of duplication or overlap. There has never been a cost-benefit analysis done to determine whether the advantages of these measures outweigh the disadvantages. And no one knows how cost-effective these measures are. Some, like subsidies to electric vehicles and mass transit, cost more than $1,000 per ton. So how does one tally the cost of impairing national unity? In conclusion, Canadian climate policy is severely impairing the development of Canada's oil and gas resources, producers' access to new markets, and future investment and income prospects for the country. The economic burden of these policies is falling most heavily on Alberta and Saskatchewan, but all regions will be increasingly affected in future. It's also driving electricity rates higher for residences and industry. Only a fundamental realignment of current policies, supported by rigorous and well-informed opposition, can prevent severe strains in the economy and the Federation. So there's a bit here about Robert Lyman. He was a federal public servant for 27 years, a diplomat for 10 years, and his full biography is at this link, and I will be posting this video and the PowerPoint on our blog, so you can go through it at your leisure if you like. And that pretty much wraps up the presentation. I hope it's given you some insights into the big pickle that Canada's in. We didn't neglect to build LNG or pipelines. We were simply drummed out of them by the foreign-funded tar sands campaign and the really ridiculous climate activist policies of the Canadian government. So I hope that you would have a look also. We have 4 green reports on our website, which are Money Matters, Dark Green Money, Big Green Money, and the Green Titanic. And these reports will give you a sense of how climate activism has really taken over all common sense in Canadian policy on energy, on climate, and on much of daily life. So, some people fear that we're actually moving into a climate tyranny. We do have a presentation by Donna Laframboise. She is a former VP of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. She's also an investigative journalist. And her presentation shows that climate activism is really destroying your freedom of speech, freedom of choice, and freedom of thought. So have a look at that. It's on our website, and along with her PowerPoint. Anyway, I thank you very much for tuning into this. Please post some comments below. If you'd like to help us continue bringing you these kinds of insights, we are in our 20th year of operations. We're a small nonprofit. We don't accept government funding or industry funding, and we have support from our loyal members. But if you'd like to help us, a $20 donation would be very helpful to celebrate our 20th year. And you can just e-transfer that to contact@friendsofscience.org. And also you can go online and become a member if you want, or make a donation online if you prefer. And have a look at our site, have a look at our YouTubes. We're all over social media, and we want to talk with you. We don't want to indoctrinate you. We want to offer climate insights, climate and energy insights, and open civil debate. We ask for full cost-benefit analysis on climate and energy policies. And we think that should be the norm, don't you? So, for Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Stirling. Thank you.